Now 9:04, and if we can start. Oh, the recording has started. The recording has started. It is 9:04 a.m. on the 23rd of September, 2022. My name is Catherine Delnau. I'm the State Librarian and Commissioner of Libraries, and I am calling the meeting of the Working Group on the Status of Vermont Libraries, the September meeting, to order. And I just want to welcome everybody who's here. I'm going to do a roll call for the members of the working group. And then after the roll call, we'll ask other folks who are here to share their names for the minutes. So getting started with alphabetically the working group. Meg Allison is excused today. The next person, Maria Avery, don't believe is here yet. Jeanette Bear.
Good morning.
Hi, Jeanette. And then me, Catherine Delnau. Denise Hersey said that she'll be arriving around 10 o'clock this morning. Christopher Kaufman-Ilstrup.
I am here.
Great. I don't see Andy Kolovos yet. How about Kelly McCagg?
Yes.
Great. Karen McCullough has a late arrival planned. I think she'll be here between 9:45, 10 a.m. Susan O'Connell.
Good morning, everyone.
Great to see you, Susan. And then last but certainly not least, Wendy Sharkey.
Yes, I'm here.
Excellent. I want to call out the efforts of Lauren Kelly. Lauren is taking minutes today. So she is stepping into that pivotal role. She's our technical services librarian at the Department of Libraries, and I really appreciate her help. So I'll say, I guess, Lauren, do you want to say hello?
Good morning. I'm here.
Great. And then let's see, Tom McMurdo, you're here. Do you want to say hi?
Good morning, everyone.
And who else do we have? We've got Jeanette.
Yep. Hi, everybody. Nice to see you.
And on tech support and the in-person room, should anybody ever arrive in person, we have Josh Muse.
Hi, everybody. Good morning.
And I think we've got some other VitLibers here. I see April Shaw.
Good morning.
Hey, April. And I think Karen Graflin's here too.
I am. Good morning.
Good morning. You have a great voice for radio. Anybody ever told you that?
No.
I don't know. In my opinion.
Well, I appreciate
it. Great. Is there anyone here who didn't get to introduce themselves or didn't get called on? Anyone we've missed? Just so that we have it as part of the record, our working group meetings are taking place. They're technically hybrid. We have the Microsoft Teams meeting, which we're in. This link is posted on the working group's website, and then we also sent it out to the community through our recent Digest newsletter. But people can also come in person if they wish to our office here at the Vermont Department of Libraries at 60 Washington Street in Barre, Vermont. So far, nobody has done that, but we wanted to be sure that the working group is accessible to everybody. So we do also advertise that in the agenda and on the working group website. Okay, so I wanted to just quickly take a look at the agenda today. Right now we're in the call to order section. We have the changes to the agenda section, an opportunity for public comment, then we'll approve minutes, and then we'll talk about survey development. And then we'll have a discussion of the working group on the topic of programming. We've got a brief recess scheduled from 10:45 to 11 a.m. Then we'll come back and talk about collections and then facilities. Our lunch recess today is planned from 12 to 1:30. And then after lunch, we'll come back at 1:30 with a discussion of the working group on the topic of technology. And then our Then we'll move to kind of trying to chart out some of the future meeting topics and dates. And then, so many pieces of paper, then at, by 3 o'clock, we would adjourn. If we get ahead of schedule, that is perfectly okay. And I'm hoping that we might be able to move more quickly than what is written here, but there is a lot to process and discuss today. It seemed like one of the things that was coming out when I was reading the minutes and reviewing the videos was just people saying, how are we going to process all of this? And so that is sort of what we're doing today. We're pausing to talk about what we've heard as a working group. So that is just a quick overview of the agenda. And that brings us to the next topic of the agenda, which is actually changes to the agenda. If anybody in the group has any suggestions or proposals to adjust the agenda or the times or anything like that, this is your chance. If there's something you really want to talk about that you didn't see on the agenda, you really think we need to get to today, this would be when to say it. Okay, hearing no changes, I'm going to move on to agenda item number 3, which is public comment. And this could be on any topic of the working group. Or really anything. Does anybody have any public comment that they wanted to share? Everyone in this call right now, I think, is a real pro, but if anybody wanted to share anything, of course, raising your hand with the reaction button is one way, and also just unmuting and talking is another way for working group members. Okay. I don't hear any public comments, and I'm just kind of vamping. So I'm going to move on to agenda item 4, approval of the minutes. We are just moving right along. This is great. Let's turn our attention to the minutes of our July 22nd meeting on the topic of staffing. And this one has a possible action to approve the minutes of the working group. And these minutes were posted on the website and also were linked to in the agenda. And I'm curious if anybody noticed any areas for improvement or wanted to suggest any corrections to the minutes that were distributed. Or if you'd like a few minutes to read the minutes, if you haven't had a chance to do so yet. If everybody loves the minutes, someone could also move to approve the minutes as submitted. And these were done by Jessie Dow, who had been serving in the executive assistant role in our department.
I move we accept the minutes.
Does anyone second?
I'll second it.
Great. All in favor of approving the minutes as submitted, please say aye.
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 Great. Anyone opposed to approving the minutes, please say nay. The ayes have it. Excellent work. The minutes are approved. We'll remove the word draft and they'll be finalized on the working group's webpage. Thank you all for reviewing those ahead of time. It made things quick and painless this morning. So we're going to move to agenda item 5, which is survey development. And just a refresher about for people who might be viewing this, might be viewing the recording, and for those of us for whom July is a distant memory, we discussed the possibility of engaging a professional consultant to work with us in developing a staffing and salary survey and a separate community engagement survey. And the working group had given me the okay to just kind of feel out what the costs associated with that might be. And I was able to get a preliminary estimate of the cost of the work and learned that each survey by a professional consultant, which would include developing the survey with the working group, probably in subcommittee open meetings, and then implementing the survey, collecting the survey data in a secure portal, and then evaluating the survey data results. So doing that analysis for us, having a professional do that work. The estimated cost for each survey is roughly $15,000. This is a spitball. And I did some poking around to see, I got an initial estimate from someone that the department had worked with in the past. And I talked to some other folks in state libraries, and that seemed like for this level of professional work that was a reasonable estimate, because this work would take place over multiple months. The person would also come back and give a report, and then the report could then in its entirety be included in our final working group report. So the benefits of doing that are that we would be able to feel really confident about the results, and that we would be able to make recommendations and decisions based on those results without having to second guess, like, did we do the survey right? Is this statistically relevant? Is this a causal connection? Or is this just sort of, these are two data points? So in my opinion, it's worth going that route. We would need to develop a scope of work and get actual quotes and potentially even put it out to bid. The working group has $12,000 of funding. So that clearly isn't going to be sufficient for two surveys. My sense is that the Department of Libraries could likely identify some funding to support the full cost of a community engagement survey, and that the 12,000 from the working group could go toward the staffing and salary survey. If it does come back that the quote for the staffing and salary survey is higher than the 12,000, we could look for supplemental funds from other sources. So I wanted to share that with you all and then open it up for conversation. And it would be good if we want to move forward with having the working groups, $12,000 go toward the staffing and salary survey. That's a possible action that I put on the agenda this time. Unfortunately, I haven't put it on the agenda last time, so so we were waiting till this time to do a vote on that. So I'm going to pause, and please, working group members, put your hands up or unmute to share your thoughts.
So is it definite that the money for the public engagement survey would be available?
I think that it's something that we can prioritize, and it seems like the type of thing that the Department of Libraries could regularize as part of our work. It's in this, it's in the realm of kind of our regular what we would like to do.
And you happen to have $15,000 just hanging around in a corner somewhere, you know?
I think that we can allocate that. It may be something we have to reprioritize a little bit from somewhere else, but I think that we would be able to find that funding.
Okay.
How much input from the working group would there be in the development of the questions?
Is that Jeanette?
Yes, sorry.
Yeah. Well, the model that I've done before with professional consultants is that you invite the consultant to a meeting of the working group or to a subcommittee meeting of people who are interested in working on the survey. The working group could designate a subcommittee who's going to work with that consultant, and those would be open meetings, and the consultant would probably since we have some other surveys, we have an example of a survey from another state that was done recently by a, I think New Hampshire Library Association had done a survey. We have the VLA survey from the past. We have some of the survey questions from the earlier work that the department had done. That could inform the conversation with the consultant. Those things would be looked at by that smaller group and the consultant. So I think it would be a couple of meetings probably with the consultant to develop the survey together to be sure that the questions are in the areas that we're looking for. One thing that's important too is that the survey not be gigantic. So we have to kind of refine our scope, because when we get into the huge survey area, there's a lot of survey fatigue and the answers start getting less reliable as they go on. But that's the idea, would be that the consultant would come and work with members of our group, either the full group or a small subset.
It's just important that when hiring a consultant, that Vermont libraries are somewhat unique to, how should I put this? We'll just say, are somewhat unique in the number, percentages of libraries that have one staff member or very little staffing as compared to a larger library where you have people with specific job descriptions as opposed to everything it takes, from shoveling the snow to, buying the books.
Yeah, that was one reason that my instinct is to try to find a consultant to write a proposal in the scope, trying to find someone who has some experience in Vermont and some knowledge of Vermont libraries. And that was why one of the first place that I was looking to understand, like, what would this cost for them, was the Vermont Data Center, who has worked with the Department of Libraries in the past on the census and understands kind of the environment here. And Josh has kindly let me know something I didn't notice, which Kelly's hand is up too. Kelly?
Sorry, I was just going to say I would support the expenditure of the $12,000 as long as there weren't working group members who are depending on those funds to pay for some of their time, because I know originally that was kind of what the money had been earmarked for. So I think we need to be sensitive to that.
Let me share some information there too, Kelly. I'm glad you brought that up. This would not jeopardize the ability for people to put in for the stipend if they're qualified for the stipend. The department would take the stipend costs on. And we do have funding for that.
Great.
That's a really important thing. So for the minutes, Kelly, I'm sorry, Lauren, can you capture that we would use the 12,000 from the proposal is to use 12,000 from the working group for the salary and staffing survey, and that the department is committed to paying the stipends for those who are qualified to receive the stipends. So there's no hit that anybody would be taking. People could still submit for the stipends.
I will note that.
Thank you. So I want to check, do other folks have thoughts on this?
Well, I'll jump in to say, I think both surveys are very important. I think in particular, the public engagement survey is a part of the requirement of the working group. So one way or another, that part certainly has to be done. I'm still dealing with sticker shock from that. That's more money than some librarians make in a year. So it's it's a bit surprising. I wonder if we can shop around at all, if there are other sources. I haven't worked with professional survey sources in the past, so I don't know if there are other sources that we could look at, or if that's just kind of what we're stuck with. Does anyone else have a sense of that?
One thing to mention is this is a preliminary estimate, and so the process that we use would be to develop a scope and look at, a real quote from somebody from folks, and it could be that the price would go down if they looked at the scope and it was less. But we could also, often the process, this is state funding, it's state allocated funds through the general fund, so we would do the normal procurement processes. We could put it out to bid so that we would get the best price.
If you
And I
put it out
suppose
to bid, sorry, if you put it out to bid, how long would that physically take though? And would that still land within our time period that we have?
There are simplified bid processes that are pretty quick, and we do have a lot of time. The consultant that I spoke with was feeling like to do 2 surveys, they had the time to do that in this amount of time. And the time shouldn't be too much of a factor for bidding.
Okay.
And I've got Jeanette who has lots of experience confirming that. So our team does a lot of bids, so it's not to worry. We have a contract and grants administrator who's really experienced, Lucy Fortier, and she could help us with that. Christopher?
Yeah, I was just gonna say the sticker shock is real, but I also feel like we're probably not gonna find it for much less than that for a truly scientifically valid survey. I expect that's probably what it is. And I just keep finding with any sort of consulting work, you get what you pay for. And that's almost certainly true here. We can do it on the cheap, but it won't be good. Right? We could create it with SurveyMonkey, but that's not going to tell us very much.
Yeah, it's sort of, I kind of have the same feeling, or I don't know how to explain. I think that sometimes it seems like, oh, I could sort of do that. And that's almost what people think about our work in libraries, right? It's like, oh, I could just recommend books. It's like, well, is this your life's work? Do you really know the principles? Do you have a real understanding of how this all works? And I think with the skill that goes into developing the questions, the engagement with the working group, thinking about it as a multi-month project, it does seem like a lot, but it is a lot of work for them to do. And then to come back with a professional report that's ready to just be inserted into our final product, that we don't have to come back and edit. There's nothing that I like worse than having to edit the expensive consultant's work. I've had to do that before. So, yeah. I do think that the 2 surveys are different in kind. One of them is like for the whole entire state, all of the humans of all of the ages. And I'm wondering if that one might end up being a little bit more expensive. And then maybe in the end, the working group might be a little bit less expensive. That would be something to consider. Yeah, that I would, the exact prices might wiggle a little bit. I'm also curious, and unfortunately, I think we only have one. We may not have any school librarians with us right now. My sense was that the school libraries, we already know the FTEs and the salary of the school folks from information that we received during testimony. And I'm curious, like, how do we, when we're talking about the staffing and salary survey, are we getting it for every type of library in the state, or do we already know some of the information? Because that's an important aspect as well. Like, part of what's confusing is that there are so many different types of libraries within the realm of public libraries. And then there are private and public schools, and then there are academic institutions, and it's like and then there are also special libraries. It's like 3 or 4 types of library already. So I feel like there's a question in there, if I can just formulate it. Do we have a sense of, working group wise, do we have a sense that this should be all encompassing? The staffing and salary should be for all of the types?
Well, that's our overall remit, really, isn't it? It's
Yeah.
the status of libraries in Vermont, not just the public libraries or anything like that. So, yes, but if we already have the information, then do we need to collect the information again? Not really.
Yeah. Well, we have the Department of Education information, which I'm realizing is probably just for the public schools, K to 12, and doesn't speak to the private schools. It may not have all of, it's just the straight up, these are the FTE, this is the allocation, these folks get benefits, things like that. It doesn't have any of the other components.
Then again, I mean, if you ask everybody, then you will get a larger response.
Two things that I'd be thinking about here. One is if we do use data from the DOE, we want to make sure that it's for the same time period that we're collecting for other libraries, just to make sure that we're on the same page with that piece. And it's likely that we are, but we'd want to check on that. And I had another thought. I wonder what it was. I'll get back to you if I can remember it.
Well, in that case, if we have to go back and sort of like check the data from other sources, it would be better to collect all the data at one time and know that you're comparing apples to apples as opposed to apples to oranges.
Oh, I guess the other piece that I was wondering about, I think we're hearing, I know I'm hearing, I think as a group, we're hearing from public librarians that salary is a huge issue and a concern in many different ways for librarians. I don't think we're hearing that as much from the others. Also, what we're hearing from school librarians is that they're very, very stretched thin. They don't have a lot of time. Will another survey be something that they'd be able or willing to follow through on? It might be worthwhile to run that by some of our school librarian working group members, just to make sure it's a reasonable ask.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about it, it feels like we will want to be sure that we have, if we're developing with a consultant a survey for schools, that we have the school librarians who are part of our working group are working with the consultant in an appropriate open meeting format to have input into that survey. You know, like I think sometimes when we all raise our hands, it's like, okay, well, we'll do this or we'll do that. What if our 2 school librarians don't raise their hands? And what if our 2 academic librarians don't raise their hands and we're trying to develop the academic survey? And it's like, well, how do we do that? So we might even need the school librarians to engage with the VSLA folks first and then come back and then work with a consultant, and for the academic librarians to engage with their group and then come back to make sure that the academic aspect matches what they need to know and what the working group needs to know. The school aspect matches what they're interested in, and it's pretty complex. Suddenly the 12,000 is seeming much more reasonable as I think about how to build it out. I think with public libraries, we have a lot of people on this call who have a lot of experience and we can represent pretty well with the consultant without doing tons and tons of outreach, right? But for the scope of work, I would want to build that in so that the consultant understands that it's not just one meeting and go. It's like an initial meeting, people go back, they come back, they go to their respective groups and then they come back. So it's a multi-step process, right? So I'm thinking about this, do we, so a question I have is, do folks think it would make sense to have a subcommittee or to have the consultant come to a full working group meeting?
You don't want me to say one of each.
You could.
It might make sense to, have it as a full meeting where everybody is tossing ideas, that then there would be in the future a subcommittee that would winnow those down with the consultant, or maybe the other way around. But I can certainly see that it would be beneficial to have both.
Kelly?
I think I would have them come to a full working group meeting first. And then if we found it was necessary for them to come to an additional meeting, do it that way, because it's going to cost us more money to have them come to both.
Yeah, and part of why I'm asking this is to try to get some ideas to do the scope so that I can get quotes so that you all kind of know what we're getting out of it. So thinking the initial meeting with the full working group, a secondary meeting with a subcommittee. And then I think it might be a meeting with the subcommittee folks make sure that, VSLA, VLA, the academic folks, that they feel comfortable with their portions of the survey. And then, probably a third meeting, which is the subcommittee. And the subcommittee can report back and will report back to the big group as well. So I have the sense that folks are feeling comfortable with me as the chair of the group writing up a scope and working to get someone to do a company or individual to do the survey, not to exceed $12,000. But I want to check in with you. Do you feel comfortable with that? I'm wondering, do you want to see the scope before I'm
fine with you moving forward with it.
Agreed.
Yeah.
I think that sounds good.
Okay, so I think we should I put a possible action on there, and because there's money associated with this, let's be formal about it. So I guess
I'll make a motion
Okay.
to authorize Catherine to write a scope of work or an RFP, however you want to say it, for a consultant with the cost not to exceed $12,000.
I'll second that.
Hang on, before we vote on that, would that also be to actually like go through the process? We've got the scope and then we put it out to bid, or we work to find someone Or should I wait until the next?
No, and
meeting?
you can distribute it as well.
Okay.
And will that
who-
will that include the qualifications required of the consultant? I mean, I don't even know what the official resume qualifications might look like for this person.
Typically, we would want to see that they have a data analytics background. And that, I would normally be looking at what other work that they've done potentially for the state. Usually, my experience, a data analytics background typically includes a master's in data analytics. I don't think it has to, but I think typically that's what we see.
I'm just way too familiar with people who have left a profession for one reason or another, suddenly coming back as a consultant without any real qualifications for doing something like a survey.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that the reason I had gone to our colleagues at UVM who had worked on the census before is it seemed like that sort of cut out that issue. It's the Vermont Data Center. They worked on the state census. They're reliable. That was, so some of the reason that I had initially just had a conversation or two with Michael Mosier from the Vermont Data Center was because he's a trusted partner. He works with other departments of the state. Some of his salary is through the Department of Agriculture. I mean, it's he seemed like a reliable person whose work we could trust. That was, I'm thinking of either them or somebody at that same level of experience and expertise. I do hear the group saying that experience in Vermont is important, though. And I would put that into the required qualifications so that we're not really getting somebody from someplace else who brings in all of these like ideas from Texas or somewhere that has a very different library environment than ours. I'm not trying to pick on Texas. I'm just, it's far away and big.
Just, yes, stressing small rural libraries because even the libraries in Burlington and Montpelier and Rutland, our biggest libraries, would be considered a very small library in many states.
Yeah. Lauren, if you could for the minutes just capture that we want someone who has experience working in Vermont or an environment like Vermont. For example, the consultant that worked with the state, with the Library Association in New Hampshire, that is a pretty similar environment. It would probably be good to get a quote from that consultant. Even though their state is upside down on the map. It's always confused. Yeah, I think potentially, a desirable qualification would be experience in the more rural areas of New England, Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont. Those seem similar. More similar.
Right, even upstate New York.
Upstate. You're reading my mind.
But not downstate New York.
Okay, so Kelly made a motion. I think, was there a second? Do
Jeanette
people
made a
remember?
motion to approve it. We need someone to second it.
Oh, okay, we need.
I'll second that.
All in favor, please say aye.
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 All opposed, please say nay. Okay, we are moving. So that was related, that vote was related to the salary and staffing. The public engagement survey, I think we should do much the same thing, but this one would be funded by the Department of Libraries. So I I think what would be helpful is I want the department to have the authority to do that work. So do you all feel comfortable with the department using the same type of process, but that the department funds it and comes back to the working group, that it's not the work of the department. It's not like Jeanette and Tom and Sam and Josh and Karen are sitting together with, it will be developed by the working group, but it would be funded by the department. Do you feel okay with that model?
Yes.
Yep.
Yes. Yep.
I make a motion to do the same thing, but with just how you said it before.
Sounds great. Does anyone second the motion?
Well,
that we
second
just
that
made?
one. Oh,
Wendy seconds. All in favor of the department funding, but the working group working with a consultant for the public engagement survey, please say aye.
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 And all opposed, please say nay. Okay. I think we have made some progress. This is great. So I'm gonna encourage everybody to stretch for a second. We've been at it now for 45 minutes. We are now moving to a completely different topic, which is agenda item 6, a discussion of the working group related to programming. I've got my notes. So it's going to be a stretch for some of us to think back in our minds. I wasn't even your state librarian yet. On Friday, November 12th, you heard testimony on the topic of programming. And you also, the working group also received written testimony on the topic of programming. So what I'd like to do today is to talk about what you heard related to programming. You can also consider things about programming that came up in subsequent meetings of the working group. You also bring your lived experiences and your work in the communities you represent. Most of you are here in like a representational way, perhaps as the president of the VLA or the organization that you represent. So you can bring in your experience, but also what we've heard through the working group meetings on the topic of programming. I'm really interested in hearing from you. What are the key takeaways that you heard on November 12th? And what are your key takeaways in general on the topic of programming in public libraries? Let's start with public libraries first, programming in public libraries.
well, I don't mind going first. What I heard and what I've heard throughout all the testimony that's been given, no matter where it's been coming from or what subject it's been on, there's been sort of like 3 underlying issues or themes of staffing, money, and space. Those seem to be throughout everything we've heard. The things that I got out of the major things I got out of the programming was things like, there was a quote at one point that said, people become emboldened to enter the library for a program. And that's sort of like, I don't know why, but that's sort of like sparked something in my mind that says, oh, okay, so then they don't want to come and borrow books, but they're okay to walk through the door for a program. And the other thing that really caught my attention was that the Fletcher Free Library regard meeting room space as programming. And that had never occurred to me either. Then the only other two things that I really found was that programming always takes time and money. And those are two things that are very seldomly accounted for. And in fact, only one library reported that they had a dedicated, sizable budget to actually do the programming and had a dedicated staff to do it as well. So that's what I got out of programming.
Thank you, Wendy. Kelly?
I had like a whole page, so I don't know if you want me to read that, or like I was actually pulling out quotes.
I think if you've got a whole page, I'd like to hear it if you've taken the time to write it down, and
Okay.
Great.
So Dana from Ilsley had said, we learned during the pandemic that library programs can adapt to meet patrons where they are and can provide cultural enrichment even during a period of great upheaval. I thought the fact we rely on our friends for our programming budget. We only get about $2,000, which I'm sure a lot of people are surprised by. And the fact that they too rely on their friends, I thought was pretty surprising. I also have the quote, Dana said she learned how important it is for people to be able to come together as a group and have a social interaction, and that there isn't really a way to replicate the library as a physical space that draws people together. Linda from Bennington, a quote was, before VLI, storytime was considered entertainment, but after VLI, the library and the community started to think of it more as an educational piece. I thought it was very interesting. I can see the communities. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I can see the community seeing it as an educational piece, but I was surprised that the library saw it as such. So it's really crucial that library staff are educated to know that it's that what we're doing and the purpose of story time is actually, you know, introducing children to the foundations of literacy, but also teaching the parents how to continue that at home. So, and then Carson from Bennington, she was talking about their return to the Garlic Fest post-COVID. And she said, it was just one morning, but for each person we met, there was a moment of connection. It can't be easily distilled to hash marks and quantifiable data, but it speaks to community identity and resiliency very clearly. And then these are just notes about Bree from Westford, but the fact that they're a bus stop for kids from school, anyone that's 9 years old can go to the library after school, which is providing childcare, which is a social service. And that she actually goes to the trouble of sending a copy of their unattended children's policy to all the parents because it's a small town and she knows them anyways. And so she knows which child belongs to which parents. And then the rest of my notes are about the school, so I'll hold off on that.
Thanks, Kelly. I had a quote from Dana Hart in Ilsley also that kind of stuck out for me, which was that programming is an essential service. And in order to provide programs, libraries need dedicated funding. Just seemed really kind of key. There needs to be some way to fund the programming. Susan.
There were two pieces that really stuck out to me. One is one that Kelly highlighted as well from Bennington, that the idea that VLI changed the way the community perceives the value of story time. I think that's really valuable and important to highlight. And something that came up both with Bree from Westford and also during the schools is the idea of that non-judgmental after-school learning time. Bree was talking specifically about, you know, having programming that's non-judgmental. There's no outcome that has to be tested or evaluated. And also someone from the schools that I didn't write down who talked about non-evaluative relationships, not having to give grades. And that idea that you can learn without something hanging over your head, I think is a really important one that needs to be remembered.
Thank you. Karen McCullough. Hi, Karen.
Okay. So I just wanted to do like a quick, so I heard that we had a public library sort of wrap up, and I wanted the school libraries to get a little wrap up too. Definitely there was a lot mentioned by school librarians about programming being really important to children and their performance. So the presence of high quality programming is tied to student performance on standardized tests, which we don't all love standardized tests, but it's the way that we sometimes figure out where kiddos are at, and having high quality programming and access to that makes a big difference. School libraries around the state are providing a lot of really interesting programming, often in collaboration with other educational entities throughout the state, like Vermont Humanities and various local folks. And many school librarians who provided testimony talked about feeling frustrated at the lack of time that they have with students. So many school libraries in Vermont do not have a full-time librarian, or even sometimes a part-time librarian. And so having to balance sort of like library tasks, like putting books on the shelves and checking things out, with also needing to provide teacher support and student support and providing programming can be a tricky balance. So programming really important, but hard to sometimes fit in a really limited schedule.
Thanks, Karen.
Yes, thank you.
I actually have a question for you. As I was listening to the testimony, watching the video, and then reading the minutes and reading through the testimony, I realized that for me, and this is just sometimes when I don't know something, I feel a little bit goofy, but I feel embarrassed about my ignorance, but I'm just going to ask, is there a common definition of programming in the school library context? Because I'm so embedded in my experience has been a little in schools as an intern, and I have a school media specialty, but it sounds so basic, but just so that I can get my head around it and that we can be sure to articulate it well in the report. Is programming done in the context of the regular school day? Is it an after-school activity? Is it an evening thing for families? Where, when, what is it? I'm thinking it's like authors come to visit and it's different from the library curriculum. Does everybody else know this already? I wasn't catching a real description of it in the testimony so far, and I'm wondering, can you share that with us now?
So from a school library perspective, I feel like the term programming is a very sort of public library facing. We generally don't use programming to describe what we do. I guess for me, in the testimony, I think it's pretty clear that various librarians have different definitions of what programming would fall under, right? For me, if I say I'm providing some programming, that feels like to me when we do an author visit is a good example. Or if Vermont Humanities is hosting Jason Reynolds next month, we'll bring some kiddos into the library to participate in that. I would consider that programming. But I think also what a lot of librarians do for sort of regular sort of library instruction, if you want to call it that, could also be considered programming. And not everyone has the protected space inside their job to do that. So there were definitely librarians sort of all over the map, school librarians all over the map in terms of how programming sort of relates to our particular job set. So I think not a ridiculous question. If you're thinking it, many people are thinking it. And so good question.
Thanks, Karen. 2 hands are up, and I think the first was Jeanette. And then Kelly after Jeanette.
Okay, I may be echoing something that was already said at this point, but I have never had anyone come up to me at a town meeting and say, what a wonderful bunch of books you have. The comments are always about the programming. In fact, I have had the library budget saved at town meeting by people who stood up and talked about the programming opportunities and what's going on. And usually these were people who had never actually attended a program, but had seen our calendars and saw everything that was available to attend.
Thanks for sharing that. Kelly? Kelly's hand went down.
Sorry, I do have
Okay.
comments about the school libraries, if you wanted me to share that now, so Karen doesn't feel left out.
Yeah, that would be great.
Okay, so Meg had said that many decision makers still see school librarians as warehouses for books rather than integral parts of the learning community. And repeatedly there was talk of a need for the consultant to be reinstated at the Agency of Education for school librarians, that they're missing an advocate who understands how complicated the role of the school librarian is, and that currently they're not meeting the education quality standards, because librarians are being asked to do a lot of the role of educational technology. And then Karen said, the student of today is different, especially concerning technology. And after COVID, they are dealing with significant trauma and difficult behaviors. So that's it.
Thank you. Christopher?
Yeah. I'm muted. No, I'm good. Good morning, everyone. Sorry, my computer like freaked out, so I was gone for a little bit. But you know, 2 basic things came to mind to me throughout, which is Captain Obvious again, right? It's about time and it's about money. And that there's just simply not enough resources in the Vermont library systems, whether they're school, university, or public libraries, to make this work. And I feel like, you know, from my seat at Vermont Humanities, where we do hundreds of events a year, we just, in libraries, we just hear this over and over again, that time is a really serious barrier, that there's just not enough staff time to do as much as folks would like to do. We're doing the best we can on our end to lower those barriers, to, you know, make programs cheaper or free as much as possible. We used to have this philosophy that libraries should, you know, have skin in the game and should contribute something to the programming from Vermont Humanities. We're trying to move away from that to make it more free for as many folks as possible. It's a slow process as we figure out how to raise the money ourselves to replace whatever we would get from libraries. But I think that's a primary message. And I think it's also bigger than libraries, right? Of course, because when we go to the legislature, we're going to be competing with everyone else who is also understaffed and under-resourced. And so it's in some way being able to think about it in an intersectional way is going to be important, right? How do we intersect with the housing system, with the healthcare system, and so on?
Thanks, Christopher. Jeanette?
Yes, and tying back into the salary survey, I think a question should be whether or not librarians are compensated for the after-hours programming time to actually be, you know, running the programs. I think many librarians are doing that on their own time rather than, you know, being compensated for it.
Yeah, I think the do you volunteer in addition to your paid hours is an interesting one. Something that always kind of boggled my mind as a teen librarian is how much reading I needed to do of teen literature in order to host the book clubs in the schools or at the library, and in order to be ready to do book talking in the schools. It was like a full-time outside of work effort to read all these great teen books that weren't what I would normally read on my own. Christopher, your hand is up. Is that a new hand or an old hand?
No, but affirming that, right? Like we all put in many, many extra hours and tried to point that out to as we do our budgeting. It's not sustainable over the long haul.
Well, and those extra hours are a violation of federal labor law.
For those folks who are paid hourly, right? Many
Correct.
folks are also paid salary, and we just are expected to work 60 hours a week.
Right.
I was noticing a couple of quotes that I had pulled out from the testimony. Carson Keisinger from Bennington had, I think that Carson had said, public library programming combines socialization, education, and empowerment. And then Bree Droppa from Westford Public Library had said that programming offers equity and a sense of belonging to groups of various ages and economic backgrounds. This idea of like seeing yourself, not just in the collections, but in the programmatic offering of the library, to me seems important, and the opportunity to bring diverse voices, to boost diverse voices in the communities seems really kind of key, to help people to gain exposure and also to feel valued. I'm wondering something in general, and Andy and I talked about this. I just want to note too, for the record, a couple folks have shown up since roll call was done earlier. So Andy is here now. Hi, Andy. And
Hello, I was trying to find the unmute button, sorry.
oh yeah. I'm glad you could join us. And then Karen McCullough joined us, and we
Hello.
heard from Karen. Did Maria Avery join as well? Yes.
I did. Hi, good morning.
Great. Wonderful. I'm glad you're able to be here with us. And hopefully in the not too distant future, we'll see Denise, who I don't think is here yet, but had a meeting that finished, probably may still be running long, but she was thinking she'd be here a little bit after 10. One thing that came up in the conversation that Andy and I had about, we had been Andy kind of got voluntold, and I was thinking, oh, I could write these summaries. And really quickly, Andy and I had noticed, like, he heard one thing and I heard something else, and probably each of you heard different things. And so I'm really glad we're doing this today to unearth what all we heard and what's important. I had kind of thought if we identified some best practices, then we could also identify maybe what is needed to do those best practices. But I wondered what you all thought of, like, how to formulate what we're saying about programming and even about some of the other topics. So we've been sharing right now sort of what the key takeaways are. I'm wondering how do we turn the key takeaways into something reportable? Do we want to just kind of, for each topic, share our key takeaways and then any recommendations that we have? Or do we see any utility to identifying sort of what our goal, like what what the working group thinks is sort of a good way to approach programming. Or is that outside of our scope? Our scope is so enormous to begin with. It's like, you know, I think Andy had been like, you might be taking on more work than we need to do a report. So I really want to check in with folks on what you think about that.
I think that that programming is, it's like libraries in Vermont in general. Every library is so individual that the programming that they will do and how they do it will be individual to their little bit of Vermont. I think how they carry it out will depend on many things as well. So I'm not sure how you would define that as a best practice when everything's so fiercely independent.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. Karen.
So I was just going to say, in terms of sort of general recommendations, the thing that I'm struggling with is that it feels like most of the topics we discuss come down to some big issues like money and staffing, which are really the same issue, money. And so other than the recommendation, like we need more money, I'm like, and that's in one way an actionable like suggestion, and also kind of not, because I feel like the answer is going to be like, well, there's not more money. So so I feel like for example, in programming, school librarians suggested that the consultant be brought back based at state library, which is a great sort of actionable suggestion. But again, it comes down to money. There isn't room in the budget for one, and that's why it's not happening right now. So a big part of my struggle is I wish that there was a way for us to create this nice, pretty list of like, here's the 10 things that could be done that would fix all these problems. Except I think all those 10 things really work out to be, there has to be more money. And then the answer is going to be, there's not more money. And then, you know, so I just wanted to express that as a little bit of frustration that I don't know. I'm having trouble articulating actionable suggestions other than we need more staff and we need more money.
I hear what you're saying. And I think there's a good reason to try to articulate best practices, which is that when we're talking with the legislature, they only know their own library probably, or the couple of libraries that they represent. And everybody in this group knows what good programming looks like. We know every library, it's not exactly the same, but good programming, oh my God, it looks like that fairy tale festival that I went to this past weekend. That's good programming. Like the people are pouring in, they're excited. You ask a little kid what book they love and they can tell you, like, and the other kids hear what they're reading, and that's good programming, right? So I think for us to, I think for me, the reason I was thinking that it would be great to kind of talk about what the ideal is, possibly because I read a lot of Plato in college. I don't know, but like you want to talk about the ideal so that the legislators could be like, wait, I don't see that everywhere. And they're saying I can get that with more money or more staffing or this resource or that resource. That's sort of why I was thinking of best practices. I don't know if you remember, but I had at one point put up this gigantic, like 10-page long document, and I had written down what I was hearing that kind of got me excited from the testimony about like, oh, this is good, that's good, this is a theme. I can share some of those if you think it would be helpful. I mean, I don't want to like force my idea about best practices onto people, but that's kind of what I was thinking, because otherwise our report's going to be like, we need more money, and they're going to be like, well, there is no more money. Like, right. If what's needed is additional resources of some type, I kind of think of it like, you know, sort of like when you're working with an architect, like I need a place where I can invite the public in to attend a large story time and there's parking for strollers. Like I described the need to them, and it's the job of the architect to figure out the solution. Like if we can articulate what we aspire to, but we don't quite meet all the time, maybe then the legislature can figure out how to meet the need.
I love that. Yeah. I guess my struggle was more like creating some kind of list of suggestions. If you did these 10 things, it would fix all the problems. But I love the idea of here's what it could look like.
Yeah, maybe like programming aspirations or something.
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
This
and
is what
I like best practice. I like best practice. I think we could, you know, that's a term that everyone understands too. So thank you for that.
Yeah. I see two hands, Andy and Susan, and I don't know who was first, but I don't think we've heard from Andy yet. So let's go with him.
Hello. My video is being weird because of Teams, so I apologize. I also apologize for being late. That was my fault. I think the idea of talking about best practices in general, right? Like what makes for good library programming is a great approach to create, to paint the picture in the mind of the legislature as to like what things could be. Just, you know, the thing I always go back to is the scale issue, of course. So it's like creating best practices on Vermont scale.
Mm-hmm.
You know, but I think it's a great idea, and I think it's the right way to go forward. Absolutely.
Thank you. I think that's important too. Best practices at scale, at Vermont scale. Susan.
I guess my thought on best practices is I want to think about who our audience really is. Is our audience the legislature? Is our audience librarians? Because when you were first talking about it, it sounded to me like really what's needed there is standards that we used to have, like a revamping of standards really is what we need as librarians in order to understand best practices. So my initial thought was this really isn't needed. What's needed is this piece that's missing that we need to bring back again. So let's be clear on who is it that we're looking for. We're looking to create this for, and who needs to benefit from this.
Jeanette?
I totally agree with Susan about bringing back standards. That if librarians had something concrete like making standards or not, and a consequence thereof, it would be a document that could be used to create funding, to create the kinds of programs or the kinds of services, that a community needs, and that should be relatively similar across communities of all sizes. But without having this tool to use as a carrot or a stick, if grant funding from the Department of Libraries was contingent upon meeting standards, you would have something that you could hold out to them. That if we only could do this, we could make standards, which would then, open up some opportunities for some grant funding or whatever. But yes, I think bringing standards back, should be part of, where we're going with this.
So I'm putting a note in I have a legal pad that I'm writing in. I'm putting a note we'll get to recommendations for this topic. But it sounds like having some recommendations that relate to the standards around programming. There's some support for that.
Well, standards around all the functions of the libraries.
Right, but making sure that they're programmatic, that there's some standards that are relevant to programming, not losing that thread.
Right, right. I
And
mean,
I
your
think,
old standards, included things like the library have a telephone. They, not only do they need to be put back into service, but also to be brought up to, the 2020s.
Susan?
and I think standards are very important, and I didn't mean to derail the conversation to bring up the idea of standards. We as librarians desperately need standards. For the working group to create a document that can work for the legislature, I think that's what we have to figure out, like, are best practices a better way of doing that, and can those best practices then inform the standards? I don't think the legislature needs to see our standards, but I guess my question really is, how do the two relate? Can the work of one inform the work of the other, or are we having to create two completely separate pieces? And it seems like there's a way that the two could work together well.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it seems like the working group, an outcome of the working group, my sense from hearing about standards again and again and again in the different sessions, and I'm sure at each of the theme topics today, we're going to hear the word standards, is that as a next step, it seems like the working group is hearing a lot about how it would be helpful to have updated standards for public and school libraries in Vermont. I haven't heard too much from the academic libraries about a desire for standards, but I've heard that I keep hearing that theme emerge, that it's not the working group's job to make those standards, but certainly that we support the creation of standards is one recommendation that seems pretty clear, right? I do think as we write the narrative, if we can agree on some things that we hold up as like the good, that's going to help us to kind of, this is sort of what we aspire to, this is where we are. It's sort of like if the baseline temperature is 98.6 and we got a fever, there's a little bit of a problem. Like I do think we have to define the baseline, like what we're trying for, and explain it to people. I'm going to be honest, I don't think that the legislature understands what role we play in early childhood literacy. There was a working group on, or a commission on early childhood literacy. There's not any librarian on that group. I don't see how you can talk about early childhood literacy without a public librarian or anyone from the Department of Libraries in that working group. There's a report, it's like 60 pages long, and I think it says libraries less than 5 times. So to me, there's a really clear need to say to the legislature, the work we do in programming for the youngest members of society, for the birth to preschool age, the work we do in providing story times is work toward literacy, supporting the growth of literacy and the development of literacy for those people. Like this is something that we do that benefits society in general. It helps get kids ready to learn. It starts them learning. It starts them having positive experiences with books, and it starts their early childhood literacy behaviors and patterns and gets them set up right. I don't think people get that. It's a concern I have that they don't get it. We would have to like fight to get in the door to an early childhood literacy type of group. Andy?
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to second what's been said about the value of standards, but the distinction between the standards and the idea of best practices in terms of the report being created by the working group. That's all. I think Susan said it very clearly, and I think you made the point as well. So that's all.
Yeah, I do. I love Teams, by the way, because when I'm at a meeting, people in my immediate work team can remind me of things that I can say during the meeting. So I want to call on Tom McMurdo, who's present, just to share something about the about standards in the legislative process. Tom, are you able to unmute and just?
Hi, good morning. Yeah, just a very quick point about standards. So I believe there's a set of 1998 standards that were proposed, but never actually went through the legislative process. So the standards that are on the books as public library standards in Vermont are the 1986 standards. So it has to go through a certain legislative process. I don't think it necessarily has to go in front of the entire legislature, but don't quote me on that. But essentially, one has to submit the standards and then have those approved through a legislative process in order for them to be official. So we are still officially governed by the 1986 standards. So any new standards process would have to have that ultimately as the outcome in order to become official. And we certainly would want to do that with anything that developed in terms of standards. So
Thank you, Tom.
is that helpful?
It is helpful. Thank
Okay,
you.
great.
Sorry to put you on the spot. I just wanted to make sure
Oh, not at all.
that
Happy
we
to help.
got your input. You have a lot of experience here in the department. Is it okay with folks if I share some of what I was kind of hearing as best practices when I watched the testimony and read it? And is that okay? And then
Yes,
people.
please do.
Okay, great. So this is in no particular order. That it's important to consider the specific programming needs and interests of segments of the community when planning programs. There were some examples of programming for tweens and teens around manga, maker programs, STEAM and STEM, and then also volunteerism. Some of the great programming that we heard about for adults included citizenship classes, language learning, technology learning, computer basics, and workforce development. Some of the programs that people shared about that seemed really on point for seniors involved estate planning, living wills, fall prevention, music and memory, fire safety, memory sharing, health and fitness, art and travel. So just really honing in on, we don't just do programs for the whole universe. Sometimes we do all ages programs, but the different segments of the population have different programmatic needs and different communities have different programmatic needs. So really considering your community carefully when planning programs. It was really clear in the testimony that programming for the youngest children should support their early learning needs, particularly around literacy. That there were some comments that were shared about program planning, and this ties in with library hours, that it's important to schedule programs at times when they can be attended by the community that is served, and also to think about the location of programs. Not all programs take place in the library. Sometimes we bring a program to a community that is in another location. That ideally we want programs to be hosted in places that are easy for the public to access and comfortable to the community that the program is intending to reach. I was hearing an increased need to have access to professional development and training to support enhanced library programs. Thinking about the feedback we heard from folks who had been through the VLI program and other early literacy programs, some of the CLIF programs, about how that really was helpful to them, that we really want to expand access to those services to people who are working, to the librarians who are working with youth and families. But then that there are also other types of programming training that would be beneficial to folks who are serving other communities with needs. There was a lot of sharing about partnering with organizations in the community. So not necessarily that the librarian has to be an expert in everything, but that the librarian is connecting community members with another expert that can come in and share with them. So thinking about museums and art organizations, the Department of Labor or other departments in the state. I know even like our mosquito programs that have taken place, there are programs on tick prevention that we've had partners from state government come and do programs in libraries. Partnering with schools and after-school programs and with Head Start. All of those partnerships are a way to kind of reach an audience, but also sometimes to link with another expert whose job it is to communicate with the public and who just might not have the right spot from which to do that, or an easy spot from which to do that. We heard, which I thought was really nice, and I'm just going to say it was really pleasant to hear that people appreciated the supports that the Department of Libraries provides, like the movie licenses and the parks and historic sites passes and the summer reading grants. So it was great to see that the work that Jeanette's team is doing is appreciated. I felt kind of a nice warm hug when I was hearing folks mention that through their testimony. The access to authors and experts is really a key thing that was highlighted, that bringing folks in and some of the partnerships, for example, with Vermont Humanities, bringing in the authors to libraries, that it's just something that libraries wouldn't always do on their own or wouldn't always know how to do on their own. And so those partnerships with some of our key partners are really helping to increase access to these resources, these individuals. And then just kind of the tie-ins, like when we're all doing something together, like the Summer Reading Consortium, it's really a boost, that kind of publicity and marketing when we all get in on a theme together, that is a pretty impactful thing, because when all of the libraries in the state are doing something, people tend to notice it a little bit more. So those were the things that I had kind of noticed as some of the high level best practices. Susan.
Yeah, just on the topic of collaboration and outreach, I think it's important to highlight the bringing experts in for programming, but conversely, librarians also act as experts going outside of the library. So highlighting that piece of it as well, I think.
Mm. Were there, I mean, I guess that list that I just shared, do people have thoughts on it? Are there things that you heard that I didn't clue in on that might be good to mention? As far as kind of what are we aspiring to? Andy.
I mean, this is a little different because I don't think it necessarily comes out in the testimony, but the idea, and it's a general statement and it should be assumed, but I do feel like it's worth mentioning, that programming needs to be responsive to community interests, needs, and desires. Just strikes me as an important point to make as a part of a collection of best practices.
I'm writing this down. Programming needs to be responsive to community interests, needs, and desires. Well put. I do want to share that the public library survey that is going to be coming out in the not too distant future, we have added a question related to funding for programs to try to get a better sense of what the allocations are that the public libraries have for programming specifically. And some may say we don't have any, and some may say, oh, our friends give us this, that, and the other, but really trying to get a sense of what those dollars are, and imagining that just like with the staffing budgets and the FTE allocations, we may see a wide variety. We thought that would be a good data point to have for the working group and for the department. So we are adding a question of that type. One question I have for the working group too is, we didn't do for this topic, which was the first of the topics, the department didn't do a report on programming, and we can provide kind of an overview on programming, which may fill in some of the gaps for folks in knowledge. Are you interested in that? And having like an overview similar to what Josh had done with statistics about technology or staffing, but specifically related to programming?
I think it would be wonderful.
Do others agree?
I agree. I think that would help with our final report for certain.
Okay.
Yep. Andy,
Great.
makes sense to me.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, yep.
So for next steps, for something that we want to capture in the minutes is that we'll have a report from Department of Libraries consultants on programming and we'll want to keep that in mind when we get to the agenda building in the later topic, but it would be good to note that in the minutes, Lauren and Jeanette. I know
Got
you're
it.
taking, Lauren, thank you. And Jeanette, I know your team is poised to develop that already, so thank you. Thank you in advance. I think we'll probably hear from Jonathan Clark. And there might have been someone else with him too, but, oh, maybe from Karen Grafflin. Okay, so let me look at the specific questions that we've done a lot of key takeaways. We've done quotations, examples, stories, or statements that stood out. Let's move to the final question. In addition to recommending standards and standards that include programming, are there any other recommendations that you think that the working group is in a position to make at this time? Or you could have some that you make that we kind of note? Or we could hold off on making recommendations until after we hear more of a report on it.
I think we should put state funding in our recommendations for all of the topics.
Kelly? I saw her. Jeanette?
Sorry, I keep forgetting to unmute myself. You would think 2 plus
Oh.
minutes into this, I would stop that. I don't know if we have the authority to do this, but can we recommend the reinstatement of the consultant to the Agency of Education for school librarians?
Well, we can certainly consider it. I mean, I'm writing it down. Well, question that I have is would that consultant sit in the Agency of Education? Or would the consultant sit in the Department of Libraries?
Wherever they would like it.
In the past, they were an employee of the Agency of Education.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Although I was going to say, I feel like having someone who can span both is good, but it's helpful to have a DOL person, only that they're like often better able to advocate for school libraries around specific things. So DOL is already doing an amazing job making sure we're included in stuff, but it's just one more sort of check.
Well, and the recommendation could be restore the consultant without telling them where to restore them to, say in one of these places, and it could be talked through. I mean, when I say this, right now we're talking like our dreams, the working group members' dreams and aspirations. I want to be sure that everybody understands I don't have any authority to just like restore somebody in our department. That it's not that wouldn't be my call. Jeanette?
Well, two things. On this topic, where would that consultant carry the most weight to do what needs to be done? If their desk was at the Department of Libraries versus whether their desk was in the Department of Education, I'm leaning towards they would probably be heard better if they were part of the Department of Education. But I originally raised my hand maybe to open a whole new kettle of fish, but to say that with programming and with probably all of the different points, the question of how this fits into the individual libraries, long-range planning and 5-year planning, to make sure these things are raised to the level with each board at each library.
Are there any other recommendations? I'm just thinking about trying to think about the last comment that you made, Jeanette, about raising the understanding of programming. In a way, maybe it's sort of like a specific programming training for trustees.
Yes. All of the things that we're talking about are vital, but often overlooked at the individual board level. As should programming be part of the mission of all libraries? Or should it be just the monthly whim of the librarian?
Thank you. Are there any last thoughts on programming before we take our recess? I feel like we've unearthed lots of, everybody did great work in kind of going back and remembering and thinking about what you had heard. And I know we've got some, this will be helpful in framing it. I'm also curious, one thing that kind of came to mind as Andy and I were sitting together for a few hours trying to think like, how would we actually write all of this stuff? Is that it is quite a lot of work to write up any of it, much less for 2 people to write up all of it. So I'd like to suggest that we engage more people in writing summaries. And I'm wondering if we can get some, I'm wondering how to make that happen. If we can develop a template that people kind of frame the notes that we take the day within, it might be a good starting point. So think on that before, and we can talk about it more, but yeah, I think Andy and I think I thought if we met for a few hours, we could like actually write one of the summaries, and maybe at this point maybe that wouldn't be so daunting now that we've kind of done a collective remembering of what we've heard. But I am a little bit concerned about the plan that like 2 people write most of these things, because it's just a lot of work for a couple of people involved. And I think it would be good to engage more of our team in the writing effort. I will leave you with that thought, and let's all take our breaks and reconvene at 11 o'clock. And at 11, we're going to start in with a conversation about collections. And we have half an hour budgeted for the remaining topics. So we'll have a little bit of a more structured conversation. Okay? We'll see you at 11. Okay, welcome back, everybody. It's 11. I see Wendy. I'm not sure who else is back. For folks who are just getting back, if you don't want to turn your camera on, maybe you can just write in the chat that you're here. Hey, Kelly. I just had my niece's voice in my ears as people are waving. I'm hearing, good morning, good morning. She's 2 and has just learned how to say good morning. So she's making these really goofy good morning noises and I keep reliving them. Okay, let's see. Andy's back. There's Jeanette. Well, let's jump in with our discussion of collections. So you all heard, I wasn't there for the meeting, but on Friday, January 14th, you heard testimony on the topic of collections. And so I'm interested in hearing from everybody what your key takeaways on the written and oral testimony on this topic were. Who wants to jump in post recess? Kelly, thank you.
Okay. So this is what I have. Peter from CVU, focus was not on stats, but on the collection flowing out of the library to be part of the school curriculum. Adequate staffing is needed to foster creative classes and curriculum. Stats about staffing. Oh, he had said that he didn't have the specific stats, but that someone would about staffing over the last 10 years. The cuts in staffing relate to equity issues, strongly impacting rural schools and schools with more English language learners. Frankie from CHS said that they're trying to shift the perception of libraries from extra to essential is one of our biggest ongoing challenges. Margaret from Charlotte said, it is crucial that our collection should not be a barrier, but an open door. Collection development needs to be proactive. And then Susan from Craftsberry echoed what a lot of other libraries said, that they want to bring back the juvenile materials review sessions that the state used to do. And that's pretty much what I have.
Thank you. Wendy.
Yes. So what I have is that to continue with ILL and Clover is a must. That a statewide library card and cataloguing system is wanted. I think that both Rutland and can't remember where else mentioned that. They wanted information on how to select e-content and streaming services. They felt that they needed some sort of like hand-holding for that. There was throughout the consortium, throughout the whole state, there's an awful lot of libraries that have Cohort as their ILS, and that it seems a little curious that there are 2 separate consortiums plus a few outliers who run Cohort systems independently, and it would be an awfully good opportunity to merge them all together. And that space and money were issues, and that but money and continuing education, statewide digitization of library holdings was an issue. And again, material review, that did come up a lot. And the training of cataloguers in general.
Thank you. Yeah, I also was noticing that there were multiple mentions about exploring the idea of the statewide library card and a catalog. And then I thought about how challenging that is as a, as a project. And that in a way with the consortia, people had a chance to all choose one thing and they didn't. So then how do you make people choose it and how do you fund it? And it just, I felt a little daunted by that. I was noticing, oh yeah,
Sorry.
Wendy.
I think that one thing that was evident that just one library spoke about the number of libraries that are still unautomated. And they do things old school. Well, obviously their collections are only available to themselves because there is no way of finding them. And I think personally, as a working group member, I think it'd be really good to get the unautomated libraries onto a system. Get them actually part of an online system, so that other people have a chance to see their holdings and use them.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was looking into that a little bit too, and I'm gonna get the numbers wrong, so I might call on Josh, if Josh Muse, if you have the number at the top of mind. I feel like it was something like 18 to 25 libraries still weren't automated.
I don't have the number in mind. I think it might have been 33, but I'm not
Okay.
100% sure. I
I
can
was gonna
check
say
on that.
30 and then I second guessed myself. That sounds semi-right. So out of 185 public libraries, there are still about 30 that are either not automated, but a couple were in the process of automating.
Yeah, that number could be out of date because we've had a number of people joining in the last year or two.
Okay, thank you, Josh. Something I was noticing that was kind of interesting with the collections testimony, or an area that I think it would be good to, I feel like with collections, there were some areas I wanted to look at more. And one of them was databases. I noticed that Bryn Geffert, the Dean of Libraries at UVM, had submitted written testimony, and on the first page says that due to budgetary constraints, the library has had to cancel subscriptions to numerous electronic journals in both the sciences and health sciences. So this is an area where I think we do need some more input from our academic colleagues about databases. And in general, I would like to know more about what electronic resources are available to Vermonters, and then also how well utilized are they? Something that can be really frustrating for state libraries is, and any library, is like you pay for a service and you know it's valuable and then it's available online and it may not be well utilized. And how much do you invest in a service, even if it's great information that people aren't aware of or aren't using? Wendy?
Yeah, well, maybe we should get someone to talk about the Palace app then, and the way that that's going, they see that going, and how we could band together as a group to purchase more e-content, because e-content is notoriously expensive to purchase.
And then there's also, when we're talking about ebooks and e-audiobooks, the whole environment with the publishers and the challenges that I feel like were spoken to in the testimony from, I think we received testimony. I'm forgetting. I feel like this came out in someone's testimony and I'm like flipping madly around the price of ebooks and how you're really licensing an ebook. You're not buying the ebook forever as you would be buying a physical book forever. I know that there's legislation in a number of states around this very topic. So that's something that is really impactful to collections budgets, that you have to keep rebuying popular items, and that it's quite cost prohibitive. Jeanette?
Going back to statewide library card and getting all the libraries automated, I think there could be a lot of pushback from libraries on that, both of those topics, particularly because they impact both, money and time. It is extremely time consuming to automate a library, and it's extremely time consuming to change circulation systems. Because, for instance, I was looking at one point, if in order to join a consortium, I would have to re-barcode every book in the library, which made it an insurmountable task. So we have to take both money and time in consideration if making recommendations on things like a statewide library card or universal automation, no matter, how desirous on the surface those things might be.
Yeah. It is, it's interesting too, on the one hand, we can't access the materials in a library that's not automated through, we don't know what they have, so we can't borrow their items. But if they're not automated, their ability to participate in interlibrary loan also is hampered, right?
I'm not sure. If
Let's
the
ask
Department of
Tom.
Libraries
He's right
has
here.
does April have a rule that if you're not automated yourself, you cannot participate? Or are those libraries allowed to borrow but not lend?
Let's hear from April, who I think is here. April Shaw, are you present? And if not April, Tom McMurdo might be able to. Oh,
I'm here. I was clicking my speakers to fix them.
thanks, April.
So the unautomated libraries, I generally go on a case-by-case basis. If they're not automated, it's most likely that they're not open that many hours, and so their staff doesn't have time to do interlibrary loans. For the unautomated libraries, I occasionally hear from them when they say, my patron wants this book and we don't own it. Can I borrow it? They're not overly active in Clover.
So if they're not automated, you're mediating their requests to some extent, April?
I usually walk them through how to log in and make a request, and generally it's 1 to 2 in a year.
So it's pretty much a wash, right? It's not like they're asking for everything from everyone else, but not making their collection available. They're asking very little of the others, and they're not part of the courier system.
That's right. They also usually don't have a postage budget. So once they hear about postage, they sometimes just say, well, I'll just buy the book.
So they're not a heavy draw on the others, but certainly access wise, it's better for their patrons to be connected with. It would be better for their patrons to be connected.
Yes.
Thanks. Thanks for jumping in, April. Sorry to put you on the spot, and sorry for never waiting long enough time for people to turn their microphones on. I need to build in more of a pause. Susan.
Yeah, so the things that I had highlighted here was the improving shared resources, statewide library card, statewide ILS, and statewide e-resources. And my own thoughts on having a statewide ILS is that, yes, it certainly will take time, but we have a number of different ILSs, not so much because knowledgeable librarians about technical services made different choices in different communities, but because we all just floundered about and came up with different reasons, more because, oh, I've been to a library and this librarian will help me, and so I'll use her system. The level of reasoning in terms of why different libraries have different systems is not a real high level reasoning. So although it would take time, I think there are advantages that would, with time, become apparent to people that would entice them to want to join that. And another piece that I have written down here, I didn't write down who it was from, but was a quote about inequality of e-resources for different sized communities. And that piece about interlibrary loan is a good example of that. But also simply, can you get Green Mountain Library Consortium? Can you get Mango Languages? If you live in Stowe, yes. And if you live in Waterville, no. So we're really not providing equal access throughout the state.
And that, I mean, we talk about it in terms of e-resources, but I'm sure it's also true for physical resources, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And interlibrary loan does help with that in a way that we don't really have that solution for e-resources. But it's not an equal way of handling things, whether you can get something through interlibrary loan or whether you can just pick it up.
Wendy.
Yes, and the other thing with Clover, it's a marvelous system, but it's separate from the ILS, so you have to do separate searches, and that will depend on staff time and and things like that. So it's having separate systems makes it a lengthier process, and it'd be better if the two could magically be connected by some nice techno computer jargon-ish.
And some great state funding.
And some great state funding.
Make it rain. Oh, sorry. Something that I've been thinking a lot about moving to Vermont from San Francisco, where we had this abundance, what seemed like insufficient, but as compared with resources here, seems abundant. Not the materials available in languages other than English. So I've just been thinking about the very limited access to materials that people who speak non-English languages have. You know, we've recently put out a resource so people can understand what they can do with the public library. But then, okay, so you've got a person here and they speak Farsi, and now what? Like, how do we get them something? And we can interlibrary loan from other states, and we do a lot of that. We do a lot of interlibrary loaning from other places, not necessarily for their non-English language materials. But this to me seems like an area of importance, and probably some communities feel it more than others. But for me, the issue of access is a huge issue. You know, how it's sort of it's the collections, and then it's the access to the collections. And I think about, you know, how do people who are farm workers who aren't literate in English but may read another language, what materials are they getting? Can they even get to the library? How are they receiving those materials? Or new community members who have come from another place, like a recent immigrant from Afghanistan. What have we got? Like, how are we going to help them at the library to support their child in learning to read in the language that their family speaks the best? So those are just things that I wonder about, and that I haven't seen great solutions to anywhere. but it seems especially difficult here with the limited collections that we have and the limited space for collections in lots of our, particularly in our rural libraries. I think Wendy and then Andy.
Well, I'll go first, but I don't know whether I was first or not. Anyway, speaking of that, our community had 5 Afghan families move in, and we went ahead and we physically got some children's books translated into Dari. But then we met this other problem. They're not, well, half the families are illiterate. And so the parents can't read to their children, whether it's in English, Dari, or whatever it is. And so now we're having to start a new system where we record what's being said as well. So that was one problem. Also, they're not even used to how libraries operate. They haven't even got this concept of you go to this building, you check out a book, and then you bring it back 3 weeks later. That's above and beyond what they've ever encountered before in their lives. So that's where we're struggling. Just getting them to understand the physical operation of a library. Yes, it's a cultural thing, but how do we solve that problem? So
yeah, well, I'm impressed with what you're trying. That sounds pretty innovative.
Yeah, what we're trying. Obviously, the collection is fairly small, but it's for the half the families, it's great. They can get the books out. It helps some of the families learn English as well because it's written in both Dari and English, and the two are written together so they can follow the picture and see what's happening.
Jeanette's going to post a link to a flyer that we just made to help for people who can read another language, could help to just give an overview. This is what a public library is. This is what you can do here. And Karen's team had made that recently to help people provide some inclusive services. I think it's translated into the 12 most commonly spoken non-English languages in Vermont. So that might be a help to some folks.
Right.
Andy K.
Hello.
I don't know why I said Andy K. There's not another Andy, right?
I'll be Andy K. I'm good with it. In relation to the New American issues and access and outreach, and this may be an off the out of scope comment, but I do think there is a value in trying to think about how to work with the refugee resettlement organizations to figure out what the needs of these people are and the wants are, because we start from an assumption that a library is an innate good and everybody should want to access it, but to figure out what their experiences are with these sorts of models, and what makes sense to them would be an interesting project in itself, and I think there are ways to think about that. And with the Afghan refugees, it's an opportunity now, to begin to explore that. The other stuff that jumped out at me were the number of people who talked about missing the opportunity for sort of collective sharing around collection development. So that just jumped out at me as really important. And the other thing where a number, maybe 2, maybe more, talked about local history collections and providing access and support to them. And it struck me as it just struck me, that a lot of what I feel like we're dealing with is this tension between local control and shared resources, and the compromises or the perceived compromises that often come with a shared resource on a statewide level. And that, this is maybe just strategic, but it's more than that, that the idea of speaking to the value of local collections is a way to let people know that
what individual communities prioritize, at least from the perspective of their history and identity that way, is recognized and respected. If we're going to make a lot of statements about the need for statewide action and statewide engagement and standardized systems. And, you know, just a thought, if that made any sense. Yeah.
It did.
Yeah. Just people are really wired and defensive around local control. And, you know, it's like I see a value, for instance, in a statewide library card system. I also imagine a town meeting where people are going berserk because their tax money is being, what they're paying for with their taxes is being used by people from outside the community, say heavily or not. And just ways to allay people's concerns that this is not, that these ideas are about saving costs more broadly, sharing resources and not undermining them, and how thinking about providing support to local history collections might be a way to bolster that idea.
Well, one idea too is the working group can do things like recommend that further exploration into an idea take place. So hearing a lot of people talking about the statewide library card, the working group could recommend that the Department of Libraries has that the department develop a departmental working group, not something at the state level, but to gather information and report back and make a recommendation about do we think that this is a good idea? You know, working group that involves people from around the state, looking at what other states have done and what the actual findings are over time, what the impacts were of having a statewide library card or a statewide catalog. I did notice something, and this predates me, and I guess I'm curious. I noticed, for example, in Randall Smathers' testimony, mention of the cuts to the Department of Libraries and how those cuts impacted libraries, how people may not have realized what work was being done and how the department supported folks locally. Do any of you who heard the testimony and who have a lot more insight into that period of time and what the impacts have been for libraries in Vermont, do any of you feel like that there's something to include in our takeaways? I think, was it Susan who mentioned the children's collection meetings that I did read a couple of people saying.
Materials review section, yeah.
The materials review section. Were there other things that, I mean, it sounded from what I was understanding from what Randall had shared, when the regional centers that were Department of Libraries were taken out of the equation, then the work of supporting folks regionally fell on the large libraries. Did I get that right?
Well, I think it fell on all libraries. When the Department of Libraries closed their regional libraries, and then most recently when they closed the collections held there in Montpelier, that those were heavily used for interlibrary loan. So when all of those books left the interlibrary loan system, those requests for those books then fell on the smaller libraries. And there wasn't a prioritizing done as to which libraries received the requests. And now that there's the courier, that takes a lot of the stress off the budget for the postage. But it's still a lot more work. The number of interlibrary loans that need to be pulled and processed and sent out is, still much higher than when the Department of Libraries had at least one, if not more, employees. That's all they did, was provide those interlibrary loans around the state.
Thanks for articulating that. I've been taking some notes. If you see me looking down here, it's not that I'm not listening, it's that I'm trying to write in a straight line.
So I would add to that, as Jeanette said, those regional collections were key, both for interlibrary loan and also for supplementing collections. Libraries could go and pick out as many books as they wanted to have in their collection for 3 months at a time, which was used a lot by a lot of the smaller libraries. And also the loss of the regional consultants, I think, for smaller libraries in particular, was a real loss for those librarians. I think we have excellent consultants now, and any librarian can reach out to them. Where the system before was more that we had someone looking out for us. So even those librarians that might not know to reach out, they had someone that was that had their back, and that was, I would get calls from Michael Roach, was my regional librarian. And when something came up that he thought of that he knew was relevant to my situation, he'd reach out to me rather than me saying, I have this situation, which consultant should I reach out to? I think the system we have is good now, but I think there is that loss in the change of the system.
Thanks for sharing that. It seems like the multiplicity of formats is challenging for folks in general. And something I've noticed that is kind of interesting is there's been the shift to the online collections, but when I visit libraries throughout the state, I'm still seeing a lot of physical collections, because with the digital divide that we have being so stark in Vermont, we do still have people who are really not going to watch a movie in a streaming way. They're going to borrow the DVD, and they're not going to be listening to an audiobook. That they may still be using a physical audiobook rather than a streaming audiobook. And actually that makes a lot of sense to me, since I can't even get the radio consistently as I'm driving around to different places. So you can't really stream an audiobook in the Northeast Kingdom, probably. But I think that was kind of a common theme that I was hearing from people, that it's a little bit difficult to just say, oh, we're not going to do the physical media anymore.
Well, exactly. And it's also a budget impact when you have to be paying for both the physical and access to the electronic.
And the other consideration is that depending on the demographic of your area, we have an awful lot of more mature patrons, and they like books. It doesn't matter how many times you can tell them that they can get it online, they can download it, they can stream it. They want books. And you're not going to sway them.
Well, it's interesting. The users of digital books nationally, it's not just, oh, older people use physical books and young people use ebooks. When you look at the use of ebooks by teens, it's not that high. There's an idea that folks have about now it's all online, and that certainly works for some people, but it doesn't work for others of us. And I'm perfectly digitally literate. I just hate reading a book in that format. So I'm in the group that is, I don't ever want to adapt personally. More power to those of you who can, but I get distracted enough. I like that it's focused. I know I can do that with an e-reader, but I
it's
think
still
that
a screen.
What?
It's still a screen.
Yeah. Well, I do think it's interesting, and we should probably, when we think about who is it that we're going to be writing this report for, it is a bit of an educational piece for the legislature. I think there's an idea people have teens like online resources, and they'll read the ebooks, and actually that's not what the Pew studies show, and it's, you know, it's kind of different. I'm realizing that we should be wrapping up our collections topic. Is there anything else that was a key takeaway from that? Oh, with collections, I do think this one is one we missed the opportunity to hear from, or we haven't yet had the opportunity to hear from the department. Can you use the thumbs up button if you would like to have a report on collections by our Department of Library staff that could focus on what we know from the PLS survey and the and also give a report on interlibrary loan activities and things of that nature. Anybody who wants us to plan that, make your little like button do this. I'm seeing.
I don't
hands.
even know where the like button is, so
Oh,
I'll
it's
just
okay.
say yes.
Hands also work. Okay, I'm seeing hands. That's good. Okay, so we'll plan that. We anticipated that you might say that, so we the band got together last week, and Lauren and April and Josh are start working on that for a future meeting. Okay, so let's move now to topic. Let's see, agenda item 9. This is the discussion of the working group on the topic of facilities. I'm going to front load this by saying in the Department of Libraries, we don't currently have data from surveys about our facilities. We have a kind of a kind of straw poll brief survey that people responded to a while back, but we don't have even in our public library survey, we haven't until the upcoming survey, we haven't asked what year a library was built or when it was last renovated or anything like that. So we're incorporating that into the next survey round, which is the square footage of your library. Does your library have a meeting room? Those kinds of questions are coming soon to you all. So hopefully we might get 160-ish responses out of 185 libraries, which after the PLS data is ready next year, we can bring back to the group. But for right now, we don't have something to add report wise. So this one we won't bring back, we won't offer a report to you at this time. But let's talk about our key takeaways on the topic of facilities. And Kelly, I see your hand. Wait, I saw your hand and then I saw you unmute and now you're muted again.
I forgot to put my hand down from before.
Oh, okay. Well, who wants to jump in on the topic of facilities?
I mean, Andy here, I can, I mean, looking over what I have here, the primary thing obviously is space and its limitations. I mean, you know, that was my main takeaway in a variety of ways, whether there wasn't enough space, whether the space available wasn't suited to what they were trying to achieve, the limitations of historic space, you know, being in an older building and what that means for how space is physically arranged or the specialized needs of the structures. That was the biggest stuff. And then looking at my notes, the second sort of largest topic seemed to relate to accessibility and difficulty with accessibility for a range of reasons. I mean, I wasn't surprised that space was an issue, you know, but that was my big takeaway.
Thank you. Yeah, those were things I noticed too. Wendy?
Yes, so I'd noticed those as well. There was the one library that still had no bathroom. There was a few that wanted had issues with ventilation systems and with energy efficiency. So obviously energy efficiency, if your building's not efficient, you're going to spend more money heating it, cooling it, doing whatever you're going to do with it, which then comes down to it's a money issue. But the other thing that was a standout was a number of libraries said they wished they had expertise to help them with the projects that they were taking on. And you know, it sort of like came out in a need for a roving building expert for Vermont. Yeah, and that's basically what I got out of it.
Thank you. Christopher. Oh, Christopher, can you unmute?
Never learn, will we? Trying to be polite. One of the things that I've heard, not just in the listening session, but also just out and about, is that there's frequently issues, as Wendy noted, about not having the expertise in-house to be able to take care of the buildings, and that can be complicated frequently by the historic nature of many of them and the regulations that exist around historic preservation. So building stronger connections with the State Historic Preservation Office, with Preservation Trust of Vermont, with the Arts Council through the Cultural Facilities Grants are potential recommendations. But you know, all of those programs are relatively underfunded. But I suspect a lot of the smaller libraries don't even know that they exist. You know, they might be in a 100-year-old historic building, but they don't know that the Preservation Trust has grant programs through the, you know, through the Leahy Fund and the Paul Brune Fund that could help.
Yeah, and to that point, I feel like since hearing testimony, and this was the first testimony I was present for, I think. Yeah, it was in March. Since hearing this testimony and thinking forward to the capital improvement projects that we've requested funding for, I know that the Department of Libraries has been scheduling more continuing education on this topic. So we've done an ADA workshop. I think Joy is here. She might actually be able to share. But definitely hearing this kind of feedback has helped us to plan some professional development in this area. I think we've also had historic preservation folks, which is great, but there's definitely a continued need for more of that.
I've heard so many times librarians saying, I'm a librarian. I'm trained to be an expert in librarianship. I'm not trained to be an expert in building maintenance, but there's no budget in my town to hire that expertise in.
I think one of the first things that you learn upon being put in charge of a library is that you suddenly must quickly come up to speed about what's something that would be nice to improve, what's something that is like a threat to your building, and how do you get things to happen? And that's something that I wasn't taught in library school, but certainly the first day I showed up at a library and I opened a closet and rebar was sticking out of the wall, and every time it rained, water gushed out of the wall. I suddenly realized how important it was to learn that quickly. Yeah. So
I don't know if I missed this, I apologize, but if we could consider including some brief little case studies for each of the topics. You know, a really great one on this topic is the Haskell Library and Opera House, which is just, you know, a huge boondoggle for them, even as it's a, you know, beautiful, amazing building.
Was there testimony from the Haskell at, how am I forgetting?
I don't think so. It's a little blurry. It was quite a while ago.
One thing I was noticing just in general was like deferred maintenance, like that we've had, the theme I kept hearing is, you know, if you don't take care of a problem, or if you don't do the scheduled maintenance necessary on your building, you will inevitably have a bigger problem and a more expensive problem down the road. That is can even be like an existential threat to your physical library. Susan?
Another thing I saw a number of times was the confusion over ownership and whose responsibility the library building is. Amy Grasmick from Randolph brought that up, as well as Carrie from the Varnum and Jeanette as well, just talking about building ownership and who bears the responsibility for that. That's more a municipal library issue than the other libraries, but it's something that seems to be a recurring theme.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's some folks I don't think we've heard from yet, and I'm wondering, were there, I mean, so far we're talking primarily about public libraries, but how about and that's primarily who we've heard from, but what about school libraries? What about academic libraries? Did we hear anything from those institutions, and are there facilities needs associated with that? We heard from Scott Miller from UVM.
His was telling in that basically he's getting pulled in 20 different directions and there's not enough money, and it was surprising to hear that from UVM of all places. It's kind of like robbing Peter to pay Paul. So yeah, I thought his testimony was very eye-opening. If they're having those issues, then it really is a problem.
Yeah, I would just follow up. This is Denise, sorry, from UVM.
Yeah.
Just to concur, I mean, he's really the only person in charge of the facilities. We have 3 libraries, and we don't really have direct access to the foundation, which is basically the fundraising arm of the university. So it seems, in my limited experience, that it's really difficult for us to raise money from funders to help, which is often a way you can get, a lot of renovations done to libraries. It's a very attractive facilities for donors to want to contribute to, but we're a bit hampered at UVM in how we're structured in regards to the fundraising arm of the university.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. Sometimes we think of a larger institution and we think, oh, well, they must have sufficient funds for this. But with the larger institution and with multiple libraries and with very large spaces, there are necessarily huge costs associated with that. One thing that I was noticing, I visited this summer, or since I got here, I visited more than 40 libraries, and I just kept thinking about how so many of these buildings are historic, and that it is a particular kind of challenge to adapt a historic building to a modern public library need. And it's the same in academic. It's a challenge. And I feel like UVM has changed so dramatically. The Howe Library had changed so dramatically since when I had last been in it, probably in the early 2000s, that it was like walking in, I just was very disoriented. All of our libraries, the service model has shifted. And so it can be really, it can be a little bit of a challenge to adapt a space that's built for a different purpose. I see a hand up, but I cannot see whose hand it is. Hang on a second. Karen.
Hi, so I wanted to do a quick summary of the school testimony. Like, there was definitely a lot of school libraries who were chiming in about their school library being too small or inadequately resourced, i.e. maybe their school library is not ADA compliant. So kids with mobility challenges cannot access the shelves, for example. There were several librarians who talked about their library being so small that it is literally impossible to have a classroom of children visit the library because they cannot physically all fit, even if they just stood still. Libraries that are really parts of hallways, not an actual room with a door or walls. That's pretty frequent. So that makes it, of course, a challenge to secure the collection, but also to do real programming in that space, because every time someone walks by in the hallway, they're also in the library. So that can be a challenge.
Thank you. Thanks for summarizing that. I just had a flashback to my elementary school library in South Burlington, Vermont, and the library had no door, but it was kind of okay because it was this huge, strange area with classrooms off of it, but those classrooms also had no doors. There was probably a lot of sound mitigation going on. One thing that came through for me here too is thinking about in terms of, it's hard, you don't want to be prescriptive and say a library must have a meeting room. And then you see what happens there. Sometimes the meeting room goes totally unused and everything is happening upstairs anyway. But that that to be successful, the facility needs somewhere that a group can gather. And if that's in a school library, a class needs to be able to be accommodated in the space. If you're looking at a public library, that you need to be able to host the community members for programs. There needs to be ample space to conduct the programmatic activity of the library. Sometimes that looks like a meeting room. Sometimes that looks like adaptable furnishings that you can move things around. But I was hearing that a lot during the testimony, and I'm curious if anyone else heard things that you think of as, kind of what does the space need to have? If we were thinking aspirationally, like what would we want a space to have? There has to be room for the community to gather. And there has to be room for the collections, right? Were there any other takeaways that you were hearing or reading related to facilities? Well, hearing none, this has been really helpful to kind of hear the takeaways. Are there any recommendations that members of the working group feel that we're ready to make at this point related to facilities? Or are there things that you think we should be following up on so that we could have more information to potentially inform any recommendations on the topic of facilities?
I still like the idea of having a roving building assessor or whatever we're going to call them, that can actually go out to the different libraries and help them do their building.
Maybe somewhere in the existing state government, that person already exists. I know they have people in the fire protection department. I'm assuming there's some sort of code enforcement division of the state. And I know some people might be hesitant to call upon them because they would worry about, excuse me, having their building, quote, red tagged, unquote. But that's not necessarily a bad thing for buildings that are chronically neglected in ongoing maintenance to have some sort of a state inspection system to make sure that the public buildings are indeed being maintained to at least a minimum standard.
Let's see, Karen.
So I wanted to put in a +1 because it sounded like a lot of people thought that the roving building person was a great idea. So I wanted to put in a +1 for that. And then also maybe revisit again the idea of recommending that some standards be developed. Anytime that there's something written down that local librarians can point to and say, hey, our library is only X square feet, but we have X number of students. It's clearly not big enough. Here's a standard that says how many square feet we should have, or something like that. It doesn't have to be quite as prescriptive, but a standard that people can point to often can make a difference. So best practices or standards, whatever you want to call them.
Thank you. Andy?
Yeah, I mean, to sort of build off what she said quickly, and including things like ADA requirements, accessibility, and things like that. Anything like that would be really cool because it, makes the point. Also, building off the idea of the roving building friend, is just more access to professional development around maintenance issues. And whether or not, this is just a question, it's feasible even to sort of try to find a way for the Historic Preservation Division, or even the Preservation Trust, to offer some of those things to libraries, specifically as sort of crucial public infrastructure.
I had a thought and then it left. Something that was on the tip of my tongue. This is all interesting to think about. So I think what we should probably do, since my brain is grinding to a halt and it's almost 12 o'clock. I know that we've got our minute taker, Lauren. We've kept her busy all morning. So thank you, Lauren, for staying with us and capturing these ideas. And I think what we'll do next is we're going to take our 1.5 hour meal break recess. And then we'll come back in the afternoon to do our discussion of technology. And then also we need to try to plot out our future meetings and topics, and think about how it's going to actually work now that we're this far into it. Because we have a few more topics than we have meeting dates. And one of our meetings is actually after the report is due, which is a great time for a pizza party or something, but not the best time for us to do work toward the report. So I will see you after lunch in 1.5 hours at 1:30. Okay? Thank you all.